Hello, everybody, and welcome to Dishing with Stephanie's Dish, the podcast where we talk to people in the food space that are cookbook writers, recipe developers, and just people overall interested in food. And when I think about someone interested in food in an extreme, lovely way, Jenny Breen is it. Jenny is the author of Cooking Up the Good Life, Creative Recipes for the Family Table, but she is also an educator. She is someone who is keenly interested in the sustainability of our local food system. And Jenny, you are also a caterer. You are involved with other women's organizations and helping us just generally think about health and food in a way that's hopefully sustainable as we move forward. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you and I had coffee the other day, and I'm so glad we did because it was good just to catch up. And yeah. I sort of had this idea that maybe you were like this like real natural foodist and really militant in your views. And what I discovered is you are militant in your like local food and sustainability views, but that you're a very regular, normal person who just wants to eat good and help other people eat good. And it doesn't have to be like this giant thing. It can just start out with the most simplest ideas. Does that like surprise you that I thought that about you?
It actually doesn't, because I think a lot of people kind of have that idea. One, that I think people think that I have like this sort of perfect diet and that I never ever make a quote unquote bad choice, or I don't eat sweets, or, I'm always sort of following all the rules or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that's a pretty typical perception. And you're right. I'm militant. I don't know if I would use the word militant. I'm very, very committed. I'm passionate, and I'm committed to choices that are intentional and that have thought behind them. And that's actually everything that I teach. It's not that I'm trying to tell people what to choose, but I want people to be as intentional as they can be.
And can you give me an example of like how that would come through maybe in your work with your students? Or because I do think we make these choices about food so political and complicated and difficult. Right. And really you can make this choice every day at the grocery store or opening your refrigerator.
100%. That's what it's all about. And what I want people, people want rules. Interestingly enough, that's my experience with students. Everybody wants rules, and they want to know what my rules are, and they want to know, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And I'm not that interested in giving people rules. I don't even want rules for myself. In fact, when people ask me what I am, like they want my label, I say, I don't have a label. I'm pretty committed to my health and I like to feel good. And so most importantly, I want things that make me feel good and that feel good for me. But I also really care about the impact that those choices have on the environment. I care about the impact that they have on local producers and farmers. As you know, very personally, we have incredible local food producers and food makers and people who are trying to make a living through doing these kinds of things in really responsible and sustainable ways. And I want to support that because I know that it's for everybody's benefit, for the long-term health of the planet and for our health. So that's kind of how I talk about it with my students, is I say, look, do you know the story behind your food? That's really what I want people to be thinking about. How did that food get to you? What was the labor situation like for the people who had to pick those vegetables or had to process those vegetables? How was the land taken care of where that meat was produced? And how much water did it take to make that particular hamburger or whatever? How many ingredients that you can't identify are in that food? And do you care about that? Is that something you want to think about before you put it in your body? So if you ask me personally, yes, I have very strong opinions about what my priorities are, but I do feel like it's really just important for us to have priorities and then, kind of base our decisions on those priorities.
So if you were going to coach someone on what a just basic healthy lifestyle choices might be, like, are there, Michael Pollan, who we still are talking about the omnivore's dilemma all these years later, not
Yeah.
because other books haven't been written, but for whatever reason, that book came through the zeitgeist and got people to eat more plants, eat less meat.
Yeah.
Is that something you subscribe to, or how do you tell your students like what those rules might be and what are the rules?
It's amazing because Michael Pollan was actually quite pivotal. It wasn't that book. It was an article that I read in the New York Times about corn. And I had never really realized how ubiquitous corn was in our diet and why that was. And it's because of, food policy and subsidized corn in this country. And that set me on the path of trying to understand this story. And that's what he wrote about, the story behind your food. So the reality is that I am not vegetarian. Like I include animal foods in my diet, but they make up a pretty small proportion of my diet. And I feel like that is the sustainable way for us to eat animal foods or meats, especially. And so I think eat foods, mostly plants, is really good advice. I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of the term plant-based that has been sort of taken over by the vegan world, because in my opinion, all food is plant-based. That's what food is, including animals, right? Because animals eat plants if they're being raised the way they should be. And so I just think mostly plants, or plant forward, or plant, heavy, is a really, really probably the healthiest way for us to eat for our own bodies, and again, for the environment. That's not to say that everything that's organic is best. A lot of my students assume that that's what I'm saying. And I think it's really important to clarify that there can still be giant monoculture organic farms that are not necessarily that sustainable and that don't have necessarily great labor practices, and, where that food is traveling perhaps a really long distance to get to us. So that isn't necessarily always the best choice. So for me, I want to know it's been raised as regeneratively. That's sort of the new sustainable, right? That what people are doing to produce their food is potentially even going to improve the soil or the quality of, the environment. I want to know that people are making a livelihood from the food they're producing. I want to know that no human or animal is really being harmed in the production of that food. Now, some people, of course, would say, well, if you're eating animals, they've been harmed. And that's true, but I do think there's an important role for animals in the overall agricultural system. And, I'm talking about if we eat proportionately to kind of what is best for the environment, we're talking maybe a few times a month or a few times a week at most that we're having any animal food, and we're having it in small proportion to the vegetables and other whole foods. I'm a big fan of just talking about whole foods, just eat foods the way nature makes them. If you can stick with that one rule, you're going to be in really good shape.
When we look at not eating as many plants, or excuse me, not eating as much meat, because I think originally sort of my Midwestern vision of this plate was, meat and potatoes and a vegetable. And the vegetable was an equal proportion with the grain, because it could be pasta, it could be rice, but there was always a starch, a vegetable, and a meat. So if I'm trying to shift my plate and I want my plate to maybe be 2/3 something and then 1/3 grain or 1/3 meat, what am I substituting that meat protein with? Because people get real freaked out about that they need all this protein. So is that coming from beans or grains? Because I think, like I'm a good cook and I know how to cook and I can open a cookbook and cook most things. But when it comes to like making that meal and making that plate and thinking about how my husband wants to eat and how my family wants to eat, that plate still feels challenging to me.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people have that dilemma. And it's because we have this idea that protein exists separately from plants, for example. There's tons of protein in plants, tons of protein in plants, whole grains, vegetables, they all have protein in them. And so one of the things, so I teach nutrition students and I teach future health professionals I co-teach that class with a doctor. And we talk a lot just about variety. Just eat a lot of different whole ingredients and you will be fine. Now, that said, you can certainly enjoy legumes or, well, I enjoy eggs or soy. I love tofu and tempeh, and I can talk about the difference between that and the soy that's we have to worry about. But you don't have to worry about protein so much if you're eating whole foods. There's plenty of protein and nutrients and vitamins in those foods. What happens is when we start breaking those things down, that's when we have to start worrying about it. And that's when we have to actually look for it and be really like this of it, because it's not naturally there anymore.
I think too, it's getting real confusing about plant-based food because I think there's this whole generation that is really interested in sustainability, caring for the environment. They've been told that animals are ruining the planet and therefore they should just eat more plant-based foods. And so instead of eating a, hamburger, they're going to go to the Impossible Burger. And they don't know that, and no offense against the Impossible Burger, like maybe having more choices is better for the environment overall because it mitigates any one thing from being leaned on too much. But, a plant-based burger is still full of stuff. And
Full of
stuff
stuff.
that, I don't necessarily know what's in that stuff.
Highly processed stuff and stuff that, for example, soy, which is the foundation of a lot of, plant-based meats, is just a really over pesticide laden crop in this country. And it's when you break it down and you take out the isolated parts of it, that's when it becomes kind of toxic and dangerous. And so I agree. I appreciate that there's maybe more choices. So, any one thing is maybe going to be consumed less. But I really push back when students, sort of feel like I'm doing great by choosing this meat alternative instead of meat. And I sort of feel like, I would rather eat a hamburger where I know the person who produced that burger. I know everything about that farm. I know how they took care of that animal. I know how they took care of the land. And I know where my money is going. Then one of those burgers that I'll tell you, those companies, they're huge. They're making boatloads of money on all of the new plant-based eaters. And those ingredients are not particularly good for you or necessarily for the planet. Now, again, there are bigger conversations to have about that, but I just feel like if you want something that tastes like meat, just eat meat. Like I personally, I'm not a huge red meat eater. I enjoy chicken from time to time, but I don't eat other things because I want them to taste like meat. And then when I teach students about cooking with, tofu or tempeh or things, I say, look, if you want this to be a substitute for meat, you're going to be disappointed because that's not what it is and it doesn't taste like it. But if you just think about this as another yummy option, you'll enjoy it, right? And you can make it yummy. So I think it's unfortunate. I mean, the big alternative meat industry, I don't even know what to call it, that, the fake burger people, they are making so much money. I don't know how sustainable their productions are. I don't know how well they're paying their workers.
And
I don't
plants
know
are
how.
farmed. Like it takes water.
Absolutely. I don't think any of the, yeah. So I think I just really encourage people to be more informed before they think that just because something doesn't have a particular ingredient, in this case, meat. I have students, Stephanie, I have them do an analysis of their diet as in terms of environmental impact. And, they track their eating for 3 days. And I have several students who say, oh, I don't eat any meat. My environmental impact is really, really low. And I say, you haven't had a single vegetable. Everything that you ate, although it didn't have meat, came out of a package. So how is that more sustainable?
Right, exactly. That's super interesting to think about it in that way. So we've talked a lot about like trying to be more intentional and trying to know your farms. So in a practical sense, where do you buy your food?
Yeah.
Or how do you get this information, you, Jenny Breen, as a
Yeah.
model for how other people should literally do this?
It's a great question. And I also know, there's a lot of discussion about whether healthy food is affordable for everyone. And it's a important question. And this is when I really start talking to people about the bigger food system. And I say, you're right. Healthy food is often more expensive than not. And that's not because the farmers are getting rich. It's because our food system is set up that way, and our government is subsidizing, the foods that we're telling you shouldn't be. They're basically subsidizing the chronic disease crisis in this country. But anyway, in terms of, I shop as much as I can at farmers markets when available and when possible. And in Minnesota, we actually have a number of winter markets, which is pretty awesome. There's less produce, but certainly all of our grains, our flours, our proteins, our dairy, we can get year round. And of course, the natural food co-ops. For being a state where we have a pretty long winter, as we're all knowing right now, right?
Yeah, because it's snowing.
Yeah, because it's
Easter
snowing
snow.
on April 18th. However, we have like the biggest concentration of food co-ops in the country. So if ever you wanted to be able to at least start shopping and seeing what's available, the co-ops have curated all of this for us. We don't even have to worry because we know that they have standards and they're selling things that have been vetted. So they are looking into that. And if we want more information, they will answer our questions, which is another thing I tell my students is you're the shopper, you're spending money. If you want to know more about your food, the person selling it to you should know. And if they can't answer your questions, then maybe you want to revisit whether that's where you want to shop.
I don't
And
think people get how rigorous it is to be on a shelf in a co-op, and that people get kicked out too. Like some of the Minnesota makers that I work with, when they go from making it themselves in a commercial kitchen to a co-packer, they have to leave co-ops because they can't get the sustainable ingredients that the co-packer needs. And that will allow them to scale up for like a Target, but it forces them out of because they might be using hydrogenated oils or something that the co-op won't allow anymore. So
that's interesting. I didn't even know that, but it is right. Scaling is hard because when you scale, all of a sudden you have to, sometimes you have to compromise. And that's why these big companies, are more questionable. I mean, and I know we're all not in positions to make those choices all the time. And so, I mean, there are certainly, you have to sort of come up with your own priority list. I certainly can talk to people about, for example, fats. Fats, people think that I should get canola oil and that's really good, or corn oil, vegetable oil, which in our class, we kind of laugh and say, what's vegetable oil? Because vegetables don't actually have oil in them. And it's basically corn or soy, which unfortunately are really not great foods for us to consume, right? The way they have to get that oil out of a soybean or corn is to use a method that makes it kind of toxic. And so I'll coach people, okay, if I have to make choices, choosing oils, fats that are better for us are really high on the list, right? Like that's a place to maybe spend a little more money, where buying organic vegetables are maybe not as much, especially, we know the dirty dozen and the clean 15, right? So the ones that have outer shells or that can be peeled. So it takes some time. I mean, often what I'll say to people is it's really an investment of time more than money. If you have the time or take the time to really think through this and prioritize and know what you want, and even just scaling back on meat saves money, right? So there are lots of ways to manage it and make it accessible, make it affordable. Obviously, when things are in season at the farmer's market, they're really affordable. Preserving food can, get you longer
freezer's your
seasons.
friend.
Yes. The freezer. I love the freezer, and I teach canning and pickling to my students. But you do have to put the time in, just like with anything, you can't get away with just kind of not dealing with it and then wanting it to work.
Okay, two questions. For fats, what kind of fats do you use? Like, I just did a carrot cake recipe, and I'll be perfectly honest, it's delicious. I loved
Yeah.
it, but I
Yeah.
felt really gross because the recipe called for the recipe I did had a cup of oil, and I kept thinking that's so much. Like, what else? And I was thinking like applesauce. And so when you're
Mhm.
using oils, because there are some things you need to use oils in, do you use just coconut oil? Do you use olive oil, nut seed or nut oils?
Yep, those are all great options. So I use olive oil, nut or seed oils, avocado oil, coconut oil, anything that comes from a plant that
Okay.
you can identify, right? That like, oh, this naturally has fat in it. That means that fat naturally is there. So it doesn't take chemicals or some kind of heat extraction to somehow get oil out of it. It's just naturally extracted.
What would
Um,
be the most neutral oil? Because some of those are pretty flavorful.
Yeah, avocado is a very neutral, and it's an high in omega 6s, which is just something that it's hard to find. We don't need to necessarily worry about that, but it's just a good source of it. It's a high heat oil, which I usually say to people, you shouldn't have to worry about that because most of us shouldn't be cooking at that high of a heat
Right.
anyway. But it is a high heat oil. So if you want to like quick fry something, it can be really easy to use. Also a little more expensive, unfortunately. But the other thing to know is that when you're using these high quality oils, you don't have to really worry about them. I mean, I agree, a cup of oil is a lot and you can play around with adjusting things. But when you're eating these quality oils, they're so satisfying because they're so naturally what your body wants that we just don't overconsume them. And so we don't have to worry about like measuring or, oh my gosh, I have so many students who are worried about fat, and that's the wrong thing for us to worry about.
Yeah, it really is. And it's a very old myth that we're still trying to come out of from 1970 when everyone was eating low fat.
Absolutely. And look what happened. It didn't get us any further away from all of the heart disease and diabetes and obesity that we're facing now.
When we look at your cookbook, Cooking Up the Good Life, Creative Recipes for the Family Table, it's been a while since you published that. People can order it on your website,
Yep.
and it's 5-star rated. I mean, people loved
Oh,
it.
oh.
Yes. So it's been a while since you wrote that cookbook. Do you think about writing another, or are your pursuits just other places? Because it is hard.
It is hard. I really, really want to write another one. And it's funny because there are things I would change about the recipes in that book now, for sure. Um, I love that because it's arranged around the seasons and it's got a lot of tips for cooking with kids, which is something I think is vitally, vitally important. Starting kids early with just being around food and being around scratch cooking and ingredients that are whole. But if I were going to write another one, and I'm hoping I do, it would be more around this conversation about just eating whole foods, not having labels, not being attached to rules, just understanding the overall ideas and principles, and just learning how to, listen to your intuition and put food together so that it's delicious, but that you also know the story behind it. I really think I'm pretty passionate at this point, and I feel a little bit I won't back down on the environmental impact side of this because it's kind of crucial for us to care about that.
Yep. Well, we're in what is it, the 10-year window of, that we could make a difference, I guess.
And we could. I mean, the thing that makes me crazy is that we actually know it's not that complicated to farm in a way that isn't so destructive, but there's so many systems in place that make it hard for that to happen. So the bigger forces like our federal government have to really go along with those changes and support people in making those changes. But it's not that we don't know what we need to do.
Yeah, it's crazy the amount of money that the government is giving people to farm things that aren't good for you, or to not farm them because we have a surplus. But yet, the hoops and the lack of funding there are for small farmers, organic farmers, family farms. It's just,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
It is crazy. It's infuriating, really.
Jenny, it's been great to talk to you. If people want to learn more about you or hire you for an event or to speak, or they're interested in your classes, where do you want them to go?
Well, my website is transformingthetable.com. It's going to get a facelift. It's a little old school right now, but you can still find me that way. Otherwise, I'm happy to receive emails at jennybroccoli@gmail.com.
Jenny Broccoli, it is. Thank you so much for talking with us today, and I look forward to catching up with you soon, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie.
Okay, bye-bye, Jenny. Breen.
Bye-bye.